The last music was so pretty. I was wondering if I should just continue and listen to that beautiful music. As a disclaimer, before I begin the program, I am totally responsible for the information and material I put on this program. World Watchers International, the station, is not responsible for anything that I say on this program of World Watchers. This is broadcast number 573, November the 29th, 1982. As I've been doing the last few weeks, or the last month, I think it's interesting to go back to the subjects and mention some of the things I was talking about 1 year ago tonight, November 29th, 1981, because the year goes so fast. We know how quickly that passes, and we forget what was in the news. I was talking about how the CIA double-crossed Anwar Sadat and murdered him, and how they would double-cross Israel, how the CIA sacrificed Richard Welch in Athens, Greece, for more tighter laws of people investigating the CIA. I referred to the Nugan Bank, that notorious bank in Australia, with the links to Hong Kong and to Henry Kissinger, and the bank that was used for Task Force 157 of the CIA that's in the news this week, a long article in the Wall Street Journal, and the role of Henry Kissinger in killing Salvador Allende. And Seymour Hersh has an article about that in Atlantic Monthly, the December issue of Atlantic Monthly, a very good story about the CIA and the Defense Department and the role in killing Salvador Allende in Chile. And I also was talking about the role of narcotics traffic in Thailand, and Thailand is in the news a lot with the DeLorean attempts he was to purchase his heroin in Thailand, and also a lot of other stories come out of Thailand, the tickets to Thailand for the Tylenol suspect and so forth. We won't recount what is happening everywhere this week as an overlay to last year, but I do want to mention some of the topics. I was talking about Carlos the Jackal and how he had protection in Syria with Frank Turple. Carlos was, I mentioned just several weeks ago, on the yacht with Kevin McCullough, who was murdered. And I believe one of the reasons he was murdered because he linked Carlos to the CIA and the funding of the so-called left, actually to the Defense Department. And then there were other subjects. The Richard Allen story was very much in the news a year ago. And Frankie's gang, the Caesars Palace, Australia connections, the White House, and the mob. Now, 1 year later, Ronald Reagan is saying that he wants to go after the mob, organized crime. And he has many, many cabinet appointments, personal friends, so tied up into organized crime. It'll be interesting to see how he goes about this, or whether that will be the excuse to kill him by using a mobster, just as they used the anti-Castro Cubans to help with the murder of John Kennedy. There are many top stories that I just can't possibly cover this evening because I want to do a good share of this program on the Vatican scandals that we've been talking about so much for the past 2 or 3 years that are really coming to a head right now. Edwin Wilson's trial has been put off in Houston, Texas. The excuse to put it off was that he was brought here illegally for his trial, but I believe it's because he's revealed too much about his working for the Defense Department, he said this week, and they acknowledged that he was working for the Defense Department when he was arming Idi Amin and Gaddafi and the PLO. The judge said, what has this got to do with the case? And they had nothing to do with it in Maryland, but they're delaying the Houston trial. California Magazine, if you can get a hold of it, December 82, has a long story on the death of Norman Gary, the attorney at 20th Century Fox, and I want to do a lot more on that. Penthouse has a good issue, the December, that may be going off the stands soon. The intimations of how Nelson Rockefeller died, a scandalous story, and how the sex habits of the very rich, how they get into trouble and how their deaths or murders are covered up because the scandal is so horrendous. And they also have the links of John Belushi's murder to the Los Angeles Police Department. And I want to update the Tylenol story, which is horrendous. They want it to fade away. And the DeLorean Motors, which I'm going to put off tonight. And the most current 250, what I would say the most important 250 murders of the last 3 months. Heads of corporations, bankers, very prominent people, civil rights people, and so forth. We'll have to put that out. And many stories on the Irish government, the CIA funding the IRA, and the head of the Irish government finally coming to Washington this week to say, cut it out. we've had enough. And of course, this would tie in, I know, to the DeLorean Motor Company front. They've had, as long as that collapses, they have come to this country and said, quit arming the IRA from your CIA, which we have been doing. And also the CIA arming Nicaragua is very much in the news. Wall Street Journal, November 27th, just this last week, has a long article on Task Force 157. That is one of the most important connecting links to the assassination hit teams that were set up after the Perminex operation for murdering John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, always under Navy intelligence. This was Edwin Wilson and William Casey and Bobby Inman, many people I've mentioned week after week, a very important article. And one of the attorneys representing members of the task force who want more money because the task force has been stopped after Edwin Wilson was making multi-million-dollar deals and Frank Nugan was murdered in Australia. The bank collapsed, the Nugan Bank, and the task force collapsed. But the attorney is none other than Bernard Fensterwald, my old buddy that I called the day the men were arrested at Watergate. He's a CIA attorney, and he's representing those men. And he also represented Mrs. John Paisley, whose husband was in Navy intelligence when Lee Harvey Oswald was in Navy intelligence, and who was killed on the yacht and had direct communications down to Australia. So Bernard Fensterwald from the Committee to Investigate Assassinations is representing the task force. And again, like Steve Sagan titled his book, The Circle, these people make a full cycle, always the John Kennedy assassination, the Robert Kennedy, the John Lennon story fits into this, and many, many murders, the Salvador Allende, the Yolanda Letelier, many murders, but the team folded up and they want more money, and Fensterwald is representing some of them. The National Examiner has a story this come Tuesday, I believe it'll be Tuesday, that I did on Perry Redwarthen, the Nazi from Oroville. He was to spring Charles Manson, and then we'd have a 6 or 10 month search for Charles Manson after the Tylenol story faded away, and he would be protected by 100 Nazis in California while the law enforcement could strengthen their muscles and the SWAT teams come out, such as the SLA. The story that I have is in the National Examiner, and if you don't get it, if the program gets to you in the East or overseas or away too far and you don't get the article, I do make copies of them and send me a self-addressed stamped envelope. And if it's not this week, it'll be next week. And then the next assignment they've asked me to do is the 12 or 14 deaths around the takeover of 20th Century Fox Studio, including Grace Kelly and a whole team of people that have direct relationships to this cast of characters. And I will be doing that story, but that will take a few more weeks to get out. And now I do want to mention where the Pope went to Sicily for the first time in 600 years. A pope went to Palermo to say, cut out the drug business. There was an assassination attempt or an intention to do it. They arrested several people who had ammunition, who had explosives, who had knives. 2 of them were German men. A third one wasn't identified, but he was in Sicily asking for the mafia to stop their operation. And yet on the second half of this program, or into the first, if we get there, and I'll give you a little preview of what's to come, and maybe you read it, the Vatican Bank was caught with over $600 million in heroin this week. The largest drug-dealing, gun-running operation in Europe, funding the banks in Switzerland and Germany. And for Nazi organizations around the world, they were caught in an arrest of 200 people in the Banco Ambrosiano, the Vatican Bank for all purposes, in Milan, where the Milan Mafia began with, well, it didn't begin there, but the Milan Mafia was Montini, who became Pope Paul VI, and this Auschwitz Pope, John Paul II, his protege. So the Pope was in Sicily telling the mafia, to stop their operation, which later, 2 days later, 3 is a direct contradiction. But there was an assassination gang that was attempting to get him, just as there was in Spain on his last trip. And I mention that because Ronald Reagan is going to South America, including Colombia. And if there were a way to duplicate the Hinckley efforts, but to erase the failure and get him, they might have a drug dealer down in Colombia wipe him out and make George Bush president, because George Bush at this time is being exposed indirectly through the Task Force 157, through the Nuganan Bank, through the heroin connections, the books on the Orlando Letelier murder. It would be very important if he were president to hush all that talk. And Reagan's pretty old anyway, so I just think he better be careful in Colombia. There was an article in the Los Angeles Times this week. The total sale of drugs in this country was $79 billion. $79 billion. Exxon sales are $108 billion. So next to Exxon, it is the largest industry in the United States. That tells you something about what's going on in this country. That figure also then compounds the cost of prisons, police, investigators, wiretappings, and so forth. The society section of the Washington Post, and it's carried out here in the Monterey Peninsula Herald. Betty Beal always has a marvelous, revealing story. And over the Thanksgiving holiday, she gives an item that I have to share with you. There were two parties in Washington, D.C. that she refers to, and one is a cast of characters right out of the Vatican scandal that we'll go to. One party was given for the at the embassy of the Luxembourg embassy. The Liechtenstein and the Luxembourg embassies are directly tied to and lost a tremendous amount of money thanks to Roberto Calvi and Paul Marcinkus from the Vatican and the Vatican scandals. Well, they celebrated at Thanksgiving, and these celebrations must be places where they meet. They look very social, but highest level echelon meet. At the party was Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, the ambassador to Luxembourg, and among people at the party was National Security Chairman and Mrs. Bill Clark, William Clark, with direct links to the Vatican, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the President's Council, Mr. and Mrs. Fred Fielding, and of course his name surfaced at the time of the Casey scandals, and he's linked to the highest echelon of CIA counterintelligence for many, many years. Also in the party was Senate Armed Services Chairman and Mrs. John Tower. Mrs. John Tower is the sister of Samuel Cummings, who supplies the weapons sales. Her brother is from the CIA. He's stationed in London. He has the largest arms factory or shipment anywhere in the world, supplying these arms deals that in turn are paid with heroin, and then the cash goes into the banks for these Nazi organizations. Mrs. John Tower is Mrs. Cummings, and his offices, he lives in London, but his offices are in Monte Carlo, and he again is linked to Frank Churchill, Kevin McCullough, Carlos the Jackal. Also, there was General Counsel for Defense, Mr. and Mrs. William H. Taft, the ambassadors of Belgium, and Mrs. Claire Luce, who they describe her gown, but they didn't go on to say that she was a representative to the Vatican, and very much tied into the CIA role with John Connally and the CIA funding elections in Italy and in the United States, money going back and forth to Italy, Italian elections and American elections, Vatican sending them here, CIA sending them there, and recycling to keep the governments that these particular people want in power. And then there was another party of that was described in the same column, which was very interesting, given by Mr. Mitterrand's envoy to Washington, the French president's envoy, and including Mr. and Mrs. Chief Justice and Mr. Warren Burger. It was very important. He said, troubleshooting roving ambassador Vernon Walters, and he's one of the most important men of this age in terms of espionage, counter coups, and death squads. Attending the party was roving ambassador Vernon Walters, also a representative ambassadorship to the Vatican at one time. They sent me to the extreme unction cases. That's the murder cases. And he comes out, it's in the Washington Post. They send me to the extreme unction cases. And he was the only one who took consolation in Yuri Andropov's new leadership in the Soviet Union. He said with Andropov as former head of the KGB, he's now top enchilada in Russia. With Joao, J-O-A-O, Figueiredo, F-I-G-U-E-I-R-E-D-O, former chief of Brazilian intelligence, is now president of Brazil. And George Bush, former director of the CIA, is now vice president. Walters said maybe deputy director of the CIA at one time. This is Walters, and also envoy of the Vatican. Maybe there is hope for me. He said where there's extreme unction, which is the CIA term for murdering someone, I remember reading the Betty Beale column, the Jody Jacobs social columns, the part of it on the air the night before Reagan was shot. And because of the guest list and the party that included the entourage of military around Alexander Haig, I predicted and said that Ronald Reagan would be shot very shortly. And within 12 hours, there was that episode from the Hilton Hotel where John Hinckley shot Ronald Reagan. So much for the social column. A very important article having to do with Germany and building up to these other stories that I want to seriously dwell at length and not spread myself so thin because they're terribly important. German politicians implicated in scam. Now, this is a scam of money going to Franz Joseph Strauss. If there were serious Nazis from World War II who are in power today, they would be in Germany. Franz Joseph Strauss, Henry Kissinger in this country, Helene vonDamm going on to Vienna. Vernon Walters is one of them, and George Bush and J. Peter Grace. Now, this is from Bonn, Germany. Franz Joseph Strauss and several other leading West German politicians have been questioned by prosecutors. They've been charged by the West German company that they made improper campaign contributions, that they funded money to campaigns, and the group that was doing this was the Friedrich Flick Group. Now, this is the IG Farben Nazi Flick Group that are partners with J. Peter Grace, who I talked about at length on this program last week, and his links to Otto Ambros, who designed Auschwitz and the chemicals for Auschwitz. The Friedrich Flick Group, F-L-I-C-K, look an index on the history of Nazi Germany, a privately owned holding company, made large under-the-table contributions to get a waiver of taxes of $175 million. Now, they had a sale of the Daimler-Benz Motor Company for $781 million, and to get out of paying the taxes, they gave money to these politicians, but we don't know where this money came from so long as the Vatican secret and the Panamanian banks are secret and the Bahamas banks and the Swiss banks. I believe that $1.2 billion of that missing money from the Vatican and Ambrosiano goes into these politicians. And this week there was an item that the $600 million in the heroin sales goes to those countries, Germany and Switzerland. Among the officials whose depositions they took were Strauss, chairman of the Christian Social Union. He's a very important person. He was questioned in this time period about contributions from the Flick Group, and the Friedrich Flick Group is partners with J. Peter Grace, that is Ronald Reagan's appointment, to cut the costs, domestic costs in this country, who's under investigation because of his 1,000-member team, who is their secret in this country. I mentioned to you last week. From 1975 to 1979, there's $378 million from the Flick Group to this terrible person over in Germany, and along with him is the economic minister Otto Lambsdorff, like Lamb, Lamsdorff, and Hans Matthofer, Matthofer, and Manfred Lahnstein, Lahnstin. So the Flick Group, the old Nazi group, the partner of J. Peter Grace, who I've been talking about so many weeks in a row, they've been caught giving $378 million to these politicians, and Franz Joseph Strauss is the first man mentioned on that list. Now, I'm going into the Vatican situation, but to get to the Nazi continuity of this through Strauss and through these various names that reappear from World War II up to the present time, there was an article in the New York Times, November 27th, 1982. Pope promises to assist the bank study. And I'll get back to this again later and refer to it. But John Paul assigned 3 people to the Vatican Bank to investigate the scandal of the Bank of the Vatican and its web network to the Banco Ambrosiano. One is Cardinal Cook, who St. Patrick Church in New York is where John DeLorean goes every day, allegedly, when he's in New York, and takes the children there every Sunday. Then there are 3 other officials, one from Europe and one from Switzerland. Now, because the Vatican has had problems with their money, they've assigned a 4th man to help them in the future and to look into the past. Cardinal Cook and 4 bankers, 3 who were originally named, will study the effect of the Vatican Bank and the Ambrosioni failure and the hanging of Roberto Calvi, the president of Banco Ambrosioni. They will continue their inquiry, but these 4 men not only will investigate the past, but they will guide the bank in their current operations. Now, the 4th man named to guide the bank is of high international standing, according to the New York Times. He's Herman Abs, Hermann ABS of West Germany. If you want to know about Herman Abs, there are books. I'm going to give you references on them next week. I don't want to spend too much time on those. I have a page from one book because it's so important. It's the book called The Pledge Betrayed. It came out this last year, and it was the promise that Americans and people around the world thought that Nazism would be weeded out. It was written by Tom Bauer, Bower, published by Doubleday. And it tells about I.G. Farben and Dr. Otto Ambros and Auschwitz and the hard Nazis and the corporates from Krupp that were supposed to go on trial for war crimes. And in the book, The Pledge Betrayed, it tells how the Americans were betrayed. There's a picture of Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor of Germany, with his state secretary, Hans Globke, who drafted the Nuremberg race laws for eliminating the Jews and the cripples and the gypsies and separating first experimenting on the mentally ill and wiping them out. The next picture is the picture of the I.G. Farben Managing Board in 1937. Second from the right is Herman Abs, ABS, a member of the Supervisory Board. He also represents the Reich Bank, R-E-I-C-H, the Reich Bank. And Mr. Abst worked at I.G. Farben. He was a Nazi war criminal, as was Otto Ambros, who works for our energy department and is a partner with Mr. Grace and the Flick group. But now, resurrected, like out of the ashes, come these people, these hard Nazi war criminals, to get appointment for the Vatican to decide where money should go when the Reich Bank was funneling money out of Germany so that they could start their Nazi period over again. All Honorable Men by Mr. Martin has the items on this man. He is in most of the books on I.G. Farben and the war crimes. Now, this man has been appointed to the Vatican to assist them with their financial problems. At the same time, the same week that this comes out, the scandal of the millions of dollars of the Flick group, also named as Nazi war criminals, funding Mr. Strauss, who is the hardest Nazi in Europe today. So a lot of people think that World War II is over and through, but those people believe in the tooth fairy, and those that listen every week on this program get a pretty good idea of what's really coming down. One other story of tremendous interest in the news today, Carl Albert, who is Speaker of the House, is writing a book, and he held on to papers that were supposed to be destroyed. And it was the 1973 plan to take over the presidency. Spiro Agnew was out during the Watergate period. Richard Nixon was going to be impeached. He was going to be out. And a team around Carl Albert in 1973 were pumping him to become the president, but then they slipped Gerald Ford in. And the article, it's in the San Francisco Chronicle today, and it comes from the Washington Post. This is November 29th. Gives you the whole era of the insidiousness of the politicians I've been talking about, the double talking, the same people that were there when John Kennedy was murdered, who did the transition for Lyndon Johnson, who are going to take over the White House for that, Carl Albert. Now, starting in 1972, when Watergate came down, Richard Nixon got the support of Reverend Moon, heavily funded, who came to this country and had his rallies. And Reverend Moon and Tong Sun Park and Susie Park were messing around and blackmailing the House of Representatives, the senators. And Carl Albert is one of those who had a little bedroom behind the House office buildings with his Korean woman. And when the Koreagate story came out, he was in the middle of that web. And at the time that Nixon was being Watergated, as a transition team, if they got Carl Albert, they would have gotten the whole Koreagate team right into the White House under Carl Albert. Now, there's a picture of Jerry Ford with Carl Albert. Part of the transition team was supposed to be wise elder statesmen like Earl Warren, the man who lied about the Nazis and the mob, organized crime, Nazis, and drug syndicate. Those were the things that were covered up in the murder of the President of the United States. Those were the people that gained by increasing the narcotics in Southeast Asia and got their power. Among the advisors, he was still alive, were George Ball, Elliot Richardson, who began the mind control programs in this country, the ones during that administration, and Earl Warren, the elder statesman. Then the speech was written by Kennedy's writer Sorensen. He was Kennedy's speechwriter, so that Carl Albert could get up and say, "At no time did I seek this awesome burden, but I cannot shrink from my responsibility." Blah, blah, blah. The whole speech is there. Get the Washington Post. When somebody gets up like Gerald Ford, they had another speech, and this is the one Gerald Ford gave when he became the president. "We want to seek to knit the wounds of Watergate, the Vietnam War, the political divisiveness is behind us." Well, who assisted him? They wanted Joseph Califano. That's the rat that worked with Alexander Haig and helped him with his Bay of Pigs and promotions. Dean Rusk of the Vietnam War, Clark Clifford, who goes back through the Howard Hughes Organization and Espionage Incorporated, Bill Moyers, who looked so elite and intellectual on public broadcasting, who was one of those who betrayed the assassination of John Kennedy and he was the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson, handing out the lies. And Tommy the Cork Corcoran, he was supposed to help them. He wasn't dead then. Corcoran was the attorney for the Air America, for Anna Chennault's Flying Tigers, and for Reverend Moon. So you had in the transition team, if that little Carl Albert, that mousy little guy, used to sit, like 4 feet tall in a chair, in case he was the president, he was pumped up. He was told matters of state by the CIA. And this whole entourage goes right back to all the murders and transitions I've studied since the death of John Kennedy. This is what the Washington Post story says. No stranger to presidential transitions. Sorensen was a top Kennedy aide, a rat, in 1961 when Kennedy took office as president. He assisted in the transition of President Johnson when Kennedy was assassinated. Off with your head, blow it up, on with the next. In 1972, at the request of George McGovern, he prepared a transition plan that didn't have to be used. Lots of luck, George McGovern. But the names here, Tommy the Cork and Carl Albert and this whole team, Clark Clifford and Bill Moyer and Sorensen and Califano, they're all there. So no matter who's elected or appointed, the transition was the president, the vice president, the speaker of the House. You may as well know that the elections are a ripoff, and these people simply have the same advisors until they drop dead, until people like these old lawyers like John McCloy or Joseph Ball or Earl Warren's gone, Clark Clifford, until some of them go, or they all go, they're all throwbacks to the time when World War II was over and the Nazis were brought to this country. They brought them in, and they protect that modus operandi that I've been talking about, the Nazification of America, the drug dealing, the crime syndicate, the weapons. There's a combination there, and the church making this world safe specifically for the Roman Church. This is one of the things that is in their heads, make it safe for the Middle Ages. And if any event happens that there's a change of policy, bring on the old team, write the same darn speeches, I won't say the other words, and let's get on with it. Now, one more item before we take a split for 1 minute and talk about the problems at the Vatican this week. New York Times has a picture of Helene vonDamm, politics ambassadorships, the twain shall meet. And a quotation of Malcolm Toon, who's been in the Foreign Service for years. He said, some appointees have made us look like the laughing stock of the world. As I said, there's a picture of Helene vonDamm nominated as ambassador to Austria. Imagine with Mr. Strauss and the Flick Group and Mr. Abst and the Nazis funding Europe and the Vatican money flowing there, how nice it would be to have Helene vonDamm, who worked for the von Volschwing gang as a interpreter and writer and invested in TCI, that corporation I talked about before and many times. Kuhn says we are the only country in the world that behaves this way. He cited certain appointees that we have and horrendous appointments in London, in Mexico City, in Paris, the connivery that goes into these appointments. And again, they speak for this very select, minute group that want to really control our lives in every way, and they seem to be swinging along. There doesn't seem much to stop them. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal, Vienna, Freedom's Waiting Room, how important it is to get through Vienna out from other countries and how it borders in so many areas. And Helene vonDamm wants that plump job, as I say, while Abst and the Flick Group and J. Peter Grace are in the news. It is a rerun of World War II if we don't watch out. Now, I'm going to take a break here for 1 minute while I change the other side of the tape. This is taped as we're on the air. November 29th, 1982, and the year is just about winding down. Now, there were 7 main subjects that I hope to fit into this half hour on the Vatican story that took place just in 17 days in the past month. First of all was the new autopsy on Roberto Calvi, the banker, God's banker, the president of Banco Ambrosiano, that was done in Italy. They exhumed the body, and after they discovered the body and they had it and did the second autopsy because the one in London said suicide, they immediately went after the people that were with Calvi. They didn't give the result of the autopsy like with Kevin McClay. They say suicide, he tied his legs around his pants. This time they exhumed Roberto Calvi, and they're going after the killers, and I'll mention their names tonight on the air. The second episode I mentioned was the Pope going down to Sicily for the first time in 600 years. I want to mention that briefly. The third episode, he asked them November 21st and 22nd, give up the drugs and stop killing each other. November 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, there was a first meeting of the cardinals. There were 3 firsts in this time period. The cardinals all met. The only time they meet is when a pope is elected, when one pope dies and a pope is elected. They were all in Rome, all the cardinals, to discuss their banking problems. And they were, of course, the Pope had just given a speech against the drugs. And November 22nd, 23rd, 24th, in the various newspapers, they cleared themselves of responsibility for the notes that the chief banker, Paul Marcinkus, had signed and given. He was supposed to honor. They cleared themselves of responsibility for the money, and they won't say where the money is. The fourth important event was the Wall Street Journal, November 23rd, this past week. While they were clearing themselves, it is a magnificent article on the Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican and how they connect together. After you read that, you haven't any doubt that they're an overlay. Roberto Calvi, and before him, Michael Sindona and Paul Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, without any doubt. And it's very important to tell you that the Wall Street Journal is carrying one good article after the other. Why? I might have mentioned before, they don't cover political assassinations, but these banks are collapsing. All over the world, the money is missing, and the Wall Street Journal is for people who have money in those banks. So the Wall Street Journal did a detailed article, front page story, and then inside a whole page practically, November 23rd, on the clear links between the Vatican and Banco Ambrosiano, so that there's no doubt in your minds. If you outline the article, which I did, I typed it into about 9 pages of outline, how entangled they are. And the fifth point was that November 25th, 2 days after the Wall Street Journal story linking in details, I mean, one detail after the other, the link of the Vatican Bank to Ambrosiano, Italy's largest bank that collapsed. 2 days later, there was a wire service story from Reuters and in the Los Angeles Herald. Still more trouble for the Vatican Bank. 2 days after the other story, there was a $630 million arrest, $630 million in heroin in the Banco Ambrosiano in Milan, which is the bank we're talking about, the bank that the Wall Street Journal was talking about. And 175 people were arrested. They want 200 people. It's right inside the bank, and an elderly man and his young Italian wife, he's from Syria, are sending arms to the Middle East, to Iran and other countries. In return, they get heroin, and they send that to Europe and into New York City and into the United States, and then put the money for people like Mr. Strauss and the Nazis around the world, Licio Gelli and Joseph Mengele and Bormann, put it into those banks. That was November 25th. And 2 days later, just 2 days later, after the scandal of the Ambrosiano bust, of the dope and the weapons, then the Pope said, I will help you solve the bank scandal. Then he pledged that he would do more, and this is the first time that he really said, because their back's against the wall. Then finally, on November 29th, 4 days later, he promoted the Opus Dei. The Opus Dei, I've done programs on it. It's an organization of lay people. He's made them equal to the religious orders. They could come directly to him. They are the bankers, the businessmen, the DeLoreans, the Catholic people, Swiss bank accounts, Cayman Island accounts, business people that fund fascism. It was formed in 1928 in Spain. It funded Franco. Its purpose was to turn Franco into a fascist state, and they called it neutral during the war so that money and people could be siphoned from Europe out through Madrid and through Spain. And they promoted the Opus Dei. They funded Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, and they have grown in power. And after all of this, even and putting on the Vatican Bank a member, a war criminal from the Reich Bank, from I.G. Farben. And remember, when this Pope became Pope, I said he's a disaster. He worked at Auschwitz, which is Auschwitz. He worked for Solvay Chemical, which is I.G. Farben. So he worked for I.G. Farben when he was an actor chemist before he ever became a Pope. He's appointed the I.G. Farben board, who was working with Solvay during the war, to help the Vatican. He's become the Pope, and they are to help the Vatican. Now, those in chronological order are the stories that I will share with you now. Number one, the London Times, November 14th. Calvi, Roberto Calvi, The Riddle of the Suitcase. In September, just this last month, there was a second post-mortem. He was buried a second time. As I say, there was no comment on what they found the second time, but the article from the London Times said after the post-mortem, they went for the people that were with him. Now, maybe there were bullet holes or he was strangled at the neck, because then they went and for him. And London Times has a story, mysterious flight, the chartered Learjet used the day that Roberto Calvi was found hanging. Now, Calvi was the president of the Banco Ambrosiano. He was God's banker. He took it off from Michael Sindona, who's serving 25 years in jail for collapsing banks and wanted on murder charges. And then Calvi was murdered in England. The flight casts fresh doubt on the circumstances of his death, the London Times said. God's banker, this is the way they refer to him, the president of Banco Ambrosiano, had the closest ties with the Vatican. The suicide verdict in London was widely disbelieved. The bank collapsed, and many millions of funds disappeared. The London Times goes on June the 18th at 6 p.m., Roberto Calvi's body was found. But on June 18th, leaving Geneva, Switzerland, and going to England to the Gatwick Airport, Gatwick, was a Learjet just before Calvi was found over there in Blackfriars Bridge hanging by a shoelace. A jet left Geneva, Switzerland on the 14th, that same day, on the 18th. It went from Geneva to England. And just when they took off, they got a telephone call. It was a round trip, and they were told to delay the call at the airport, delay in London, that somebody at the Gatwick airport was to get on the plane. 4 people were on the plane. It was chartered by Hans Albert Kunz, K-U-N-Z, a Swiss businessman. He arranged Roberta Calvi's flight to London 4 days later, Hans Albert Kunz, and he's supposed to have the record and, of course, the who's who of the Opus Dei has to be with him, as well as a list of $500 million to $1 billion where it went. Now, Flavia Carboni, who was arrested, and he's in Italy now, called from London to Geneva and told the airport, stall a while or wait for me. He was delayed. And they waited at the airport. There were 2 men and 2 women on the airplane. They had no luggage or satchels of any kind. They went to Gatwick. They waited 99 minutes. Somebody was at the airport, and they picked up a piece of luggage, which was Roberta Calvi's material that he had taken, obviously, from Switzerland. The passengers left. They had left without luggage in Geneva. They had a medium-sized suitcase and went back to Geneva the same day. And the article says that what was in the suitcase would unravel the 800 million or more siphoned from Banco Ambrosiano. But the importance of the suitcase, what the Italians believe, it will be the key to many of these stories. Now, Hans Albert Kunz admitted to the London Times that he chartered that plane for Calvi, and he also chartered the one on June the 14th. Now, you remember how important that week was. I've mentioned many times. In Geneva on June the 14th, when Calvi left there, Edwin Wilson was in Geneva and then went to Zurich, and 2 days later he picked up $18 million before he came. And he's blowing the story. Raymond Donovan, our Secretary of Labor under investigation with mob ties and defended by Helene vonDamm, was in Geneva June the 14th. Pope John Paul II was in Geneva June the 14th. He flew in there from Argentina, where Licio Gelli was at the time. Calvi left there. He was in the same city with the Pope, with Raymond Donovan, and Licio Gelli, of course, had given money to Reagan's campaign and was at the inauguration. And he was still in hiding. And King Khaled, K-H-A-L-E-D, from Saudi Arabia, died that day. And Alexander Haig and George Bush took an airplane and flew over to Saudi Arabia, and $22 billion of Saudi Arabian money was linked to the Banco Ambrosiano, Roberta Calvi, the Masonic Lodge. So the day that Calvi left Geneva, these people also were in Geneva. Now, they're looking for the people that went with Calvi or took the plane over. There was an Andrea Carboni, as I say, who checked into Geneva, Switzerland, and went to the Hotel Century, where he met Italian decorator Ugo Flavoni, F-L-A-V-O-N-I. He checks into Geneva June the 17th. And June the 18th, 1 day later, he is joined by 3 unknown people. And on the 18th, they fly in, they are stalled over, and they fly to England. There are 4 people on the plane. The decorator said he was to pick up 12,500 pounds, British pounds, be about $24,000. He was in there to collect money to decorate some Rome offices. Now, the Lear jet plane was paid for by Mr. Kunz. The London Times began investigating what dates Calvi went to London. The plane that flew in hours, the same hours that he was being killed, this plane was flying over. Somebody met the plane and took his satchel or the suitcase back to Geneva, and therefore the notorious Opus Dei, if he had that material, and he was one of the heads of the secret Masonic Lodge to bring fascism to all of Europe and South America. The list was there, and it was returned safely in their hands. Now, the second item I mentioned, going in that chronological order, the Pope giving the tongue lashing down in Palermo, Switzerland, also in not Palermo, Sicily, where the mob is. But out of Palermo comes a Monsignor Arrigo Pintonelli. His name is Arrigo Pintonello. He's an honorary military archbishop. He represents the dark side of the Rome religious life. And the men arrested in the Ambrosiano, they referred to them as part of a cult. That $500 or $600 million was a part of the Catholic cult. And Pintinelli he was born in Venice, but his home base is in Palermo, Sicily, with the Thule Society, Thule Society, that worship the Nordic race cults. And that is the home base there. So I'm not sure that the Pope went there to scold the mafia, considering the Ambrosiano was loaded with all these millions to fund his favorite groups and organizations. The excuse was to give a scolding to the mafia. But considering the people down there in Sicily and his first trip there, I think it's very significant. Now, on November 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, as I say, were the articles. The Pope sets new rules on Vatican finances. This is Wall Street Journal. He's going to be careful. He's only going to use Peter's pens. He's not going to invest in the mob and syndicate. And John Cardinal Kroll of Philadelphia, that's Grace Kelly's cardinal. Cardinal Cook is John DeLorean's special one. He was on that 15-member commission to report to the Pope about the Vatican Bank and Paul Marcinkus. And at that point, he was very, I'm humble. I will help you, but we'll clear the bank. We're not responsible for any of the involvement of the scandal. We're not going to pay this note that was promised by Paul Marcinkus. Now, the long article in Wall Street Journal, November 23rd, how the Vatican Bank got itself implicated in the Ambrosiano scandal. I won't have time tonight. I want to go into the drug bust, but I'll get back to this later. This article is the history of Paul Marcinkus, the head banker of the Vatican from Chicago, from Cicero, Illinois, the Capone gang area, how he became the head banker without any banking experience. The article goes into the chronology, and one of the men defending Paul Marcinkus in this article on the front page, the Wall Street Journal, is Robert F. Wagner, former mayor of New York City, President Carter's envoy to the bank. Now, last week I mentioned the father of Wagner, the father of Robert F. Wagner, was a law partner with Mr. Rifkin, who formed the von Bolschwing Galen network in the United States, in Europe, that office TCI, how Wagner's, his role with this corporation of CTC that became TCI with Helene vonDamm and von Bolschwing. Wagner, Robert F. Wagner, the father, was a law partner with Rifkin. The Wagner, who's defending Marcinkus, is the son of the other Robert F. Wagner, who went to Fordham University, St. John's Law School. He was a representative in the Vatican for Jimmy Carter and the U.S. ambassador to Spain in 1968-69. So the people defending Marcinkus and the Vatican finances have a direct involvement, if not an indirect, I would say a direct involvement in a tangled web of finances. And of course, they're out there defending what went on. This Wall Street Journal article goes into the career of Marcinkus from 1952 and his first trip, arranging his first assignment for the Pope to go to India in 1964. And how after John Kennedy was murdered, how the Americans took over and meshed the CIA with the Nixon administration. From 64, they had controlled the Vatican, the CIA, even before. But this goes into 1972. Archbishop Marcinkus joins the board of Italy's Banco Ambrosiano. It tells about the trips he planned for the popes, how he joins the bank, how Marcinkus used Roberto Calvi for sensitive political operations, how Marco Sindona worked with them. They had a secret group called Suprafin, Suprafin, and then capital S, small p, capital A, Suprafin. The Vatican Bank gets more involved, according to the Wall Street Journal. A long confidential report came out in 1978, and it continued up to the present, called a super mysterious company, the Suprafin. And this tangled web shows how they borrowed money from Banco Ambrosiano, the Vatican, under the direction of the Ambrosiano officials, and they formed a company called Suprafin. They bought stocks in it and built shell companies in Liechtenstein and in Panama and, of course, in the Bahamas. Suprafin is pertinent to the Vatican operations, according to the Wall Street Journal. It is a convoluted web of managing and mismanaging investments, divestments in the absolute marriage of the Vatican Bank and Roberto Calvi of Banco Ambrosiano. The webbing of these people is tangled very, very tightly. In 1978, they linked the mysterious Roberto Calvi and the Vatican Bank involvement to the Suprafin. It is a dummy front title of money mishandling and shenanigans, and I will try next week. I really will go into detail on this article from the Wall Street Journal that I outlined, as I say, into 9 pages, because without any doubt, it makes very loud and clear these characters that I've been talking about, Roberto Calvi and Paul Marcinkus from Cicero, Illinois. But the big story that followed that I do want to do, because we run out of time, unfortunately, was that one, still more trouble for Banco Ambrosiano. The police are investigating whether the Vatican Bank finances arms, drug deals. The popes and cardinals discuss the issue. Now, this is right there on the front page, what I've been trying to tell people, and it isn't a question of being anti-Catholic. I talk about the drug deals of Sharon and the Israeli government and Begin and their role with Lebanon and narcotics, the Israeli mafia. But this is really a control situation. The article says in Milan, the Italian police are going into the Banco Ambrosiano and investigating whether they were the ones that financed the international gang of arms and drug dealers. Reported on Italian television this week that the Vatican had assisted in the financing of an international gang of arms and drug dealers with the Banco Ambrosiano. TV Italian channel RAI said, in quotes, the police are looking into and questioning bank officials after it was learned that smugglers were part of the largest world organization of illegal arms traffic, and they had their offices in the Ambrosiano Bank in Milan. That's the bank where the secretary to Roberto Calvi went flying out of the window June 17th, and he was found dead June the 18th. According to the newspaper, quotes, the gang, inside Banco Ambrosiano property, furnished Middle East countries, including Iran, with arms. They exported them illegally from Europe and from the United States. No other countries were mentioned. They didn't identify the Middle East countries, but when the Pope was entertaining Arafat, and Wilson and Turple and Corcola and the CIA were funding Arafat, then you know, because these people work together, that one of the countries also, the gang, was the PLO, and he probably had them there to apologize for what the naughty Israelis and the Lebanese did in cleaning them out. That's why he had the Pope there. The Pope had Arafat in the Vatican just at that time. No other countries were named. The military hardware includes helicopters, armored cars, exported illegally, traded for drugs, mainly heroin, sold in the United States. This is the Los Angeles Herald Examiner. The mastermind of this operation is Henry Arsan, a 70-year-old Syrian, and his Italian wife Giovanni, who's 54 years old. They've been charged with illegal traffic and weapons. Arsan owns a hauling company and uses the offices of Banco Ambrosiano in Milan that was the front for the gang. And they've issued warrants for arrest for the full gang. It took 2 years. They've been investigating this, interestingly enough, for 2 years, the same amount of time that they've been investigating the Flick Group funding Mr. Strauss. The money went into banks in West Germany, in Austria. Now, I think vonDamm would be our ambassador to Austria. Mr. Strauss, the controlling politician in West Germany with the Flick Group, and in Switzerland, of course, the notorious Swiss banks. They've been under investigation on a lead since 1980, and they just got busted in the bank the same day that the cardinals were meeting in Rome, not too far from Milan. That was a story, still more trouble for Banco Ambrosiano. Then Los Angeles Times had another story, ring trading guns and tanks for drugs reported broken. Investigators had cracked the world's largest illegal arms traffic. Isn't it ironic that the largest group of arms and weapons comes out of the Banco Ambrosiano when for so many years I have tried to say that that money is going to Germany, South America, for people like Strauss and for Licio Gelli and for the Opus Dei, which doesn't need money. It pumps money and businesses into this group. But as a side, they have the weapons and narcotics. The LA Times says the agents were paid off in Turkey and in other Mideast countries. And when they mentioned Turkey, they quickly arrested about 3 men last week who tried to shoot the Pope. NBC said it was the KGB, and with the new KGB, the former KGB chief, as the head of the Soviet Union, I told you that a lot of the lies that we've been fed will have to be erased because Mr. Andropov knows what happened. So when the story broke, they brought in 3 of the men, and they're looking for 2 more in the conspiracy of shooting the Pope. I wish we would do this in this country and get the Nazis with John Hinckley that traveled around the country and the second gunman at the Hilton Hotel and the cover-up of the shooting of Ronald Reagan, the attempt on his life. The LA Times story says the gang has links with weapon manufacturers in France, in West Germany, and Belgium. And, of course, West Germany and Belgium buy them from Mr. Samuel Cummings, whose brother-in-law is head of our Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, the great John Tower. It's his sister who's married to John Tower. The deliveries were in trailers and trucks. Some went overland. There are 41 Italian, Turks, Lebanese, Syrians arrested at the time. The trial date for the first few will be February 1983. Drugs worth more than $690 million were confiscated in the Banco Ambrosiano building. They are terminals for the world's biggest arms traffic and drug operation. It happens to be in the offices of the bank where Calvi was, where his secretary was, as I say, where she went flying out the window. And they operated in offices called Export-Import Agency STIBAM, S-T-I-B-A-M, International Transport. Their offices are in Milan, in New York, and Liechtenstein. And, of course, the other outline of the Wall Street Journal story on the Banco Ambrosiano goes into Luxembourg and Liechtenstein. So that's how we get so many narcotics in this country. But they're going to fascist purposes. And then to wind up the week, as if that wasn't enough, the Pope decided to elevate the Opus Dei. And this morning's Chronicle, it was on page 37 of the TV section between boxing and a football game. A 1-inch statement, Opus Dei strengthened the Vatican, boosted the power yesterday of the staunchy conservative Opus Dei, one of the wealthiest and most influential Roman Catholic lay organizations, by making its leader a personal prelate answerable to the Pope. The UPI had a story this past week in the Oakland Tribune that one of the World Watcher subscribers said to me, John Paul II has elevated the Opus Dei, and you see with lay people, they can be the bankers from the Reich Bank, from the Deutsche Bank, from the German Nazi banks that are in full swing now in the Credit Suisse. There are 72,000 members in this organization, if that doesn't scare you, in 80 countries. Secrecy and hidden tactics are their methods. A member of that group who's at Oxford in Great Britain was quoted in the newspaper this last week of saying, using the quotations that I use, of wanting to put us back to the Middle Ages. And he said that the group is so totalitarian that they take control of their young. It's compared to Reverend Moon and the sex and the cults. They have fascist ideals, the Hitler Youth. Those of you who hear the program locally, tomorrow night, Tuesday and Wednesday, there's going to be several hours, 4 hours, on the training of Hitler Youth on how to taste blood, smell blood, and so forth. Now, these are the business people that will raise the money and network. Business also is the narcotics, the trucks, the weapons, the people not wearing the cloth, in the Vatican itself. Now, I want to do more on the outline of the intermingling of the Ambrosiano with the Vatican from Wall Street Journal, because there are other important articles of the Ambrosiano and Licio Gelli to Mussolini. In fact, the Wall Street Journal mentions the Mussolini fascists in this particular article, and the danger and how they're using the money for political purposes in South America and Central America, that they've used dummy fronts, that the money for weapons and drugs is used for politics and swastikas and Nazi literature, this is what is happening. And so when the Pope makes an appointment to the Vatican to look into investments for the Vatican and puts a man on there like Herman, you have a full cycle. A board of directors from IG Farben is working and looking into funding of Vatican money in the future with John Paul II, who worked for IG Farben at Auschwitz. Things that I have said in separate items or books of articles are coming together each week. Just in 1 week, series of articles are coming together. The cast of characters are meeting head on, or however you want to call it. They're all there in the news. It is a terrifying time, but it's an interesting time. How can you study it? Just start with point A. Start today and read the paper. Get some of those articles I mentioned. There's no other way to do it. Well, the hour is up, and it's time for some nice, sweet music. Be sure to send money to this station, or I think it's going to go off the air. They do not have enough subscribers, and they need them, and I'm not kidding. It's desperate. Do whatever you can. This is Mae Brussell. This is KAZU, and it is Pacific Grove, California.
The views expressed by Mae Brussell during World Watchers are those of the commentator and do not reflect the opinions of KAZU, its board of directors, or staff.